Today, we're going to be talking about the government role in promoting sustainability. It's probably useful for you to understand my background. My core discipline is law, but for 50 years, I have spent my time interacting with scientists and engineers, and always with an eye toward how to take ideas, technology, concepts, and even politics and make sustainability work. So we need to start this with several critical questions. What is and what defined and who defined sustainability? Sustainability is a concept, ancient and modern. For purposes of this discussion, we're going to start with the late 20th century and work all the way up to New Jersey in 2025. The widest lens to examine about how government works in relationship to the private sector and all aspects of sustainability is through the lens of mandate versus motivate. What's the role of the private sector and at what level? The non-governmental organization, environmental groups, and then, of course, the private sector. And the private sector is everybody from personal care products to public utilities. Is there an operative role model for all of the above? And the answer is conveniently yes. Now, before we get to that example, we need to take a look at scientists and public figures that have been advocating for sustainability concepts and what the impact has been of that advocacy. So if we want to go back to look at the start of the modern environmental movement, it can arguably start with Rachel Carson and publication of her book, Silent Spring. This led to the Endangered Species Act and the elimination of DDT as a pesticide. Why? Because there was a political linkage to this. The bald eagle, the symbol of national strength and unity for the United States, was in the process of going into extinct. And that was because DDT, as an effective pesticide against mosquitoes and other things, was essentially killing our national role model. If we move forward all the way up to 1987, the Brundtland Report, Our Common Future, published by the United Nations Environmental Program, represents the first systematic benchmark of defining sustainability. However, it really did not have the same paradigm-shifting impact on the political and private sectors as Rachel Carson's report did. We can then go to Vice President Al Gore, who published a book called Earth in the Balance. He first identified climate change, at least in the modern political context, as something totally related to sustainability. Then, of course, we had one big event in the late 1990s, which led to immediate political and economic action. That was the Rio Treaty and the Montreal Protocol eliminating CFCs in the upper atmosphere. Why was this a paradigm shift? Because with the deterioration of the upper ozone layer, all biological life on Earth was on a path toward extinction. That was a success, but in the years since then, as we've struggled with other types of impacts, ocean acidification, deforestation of the rainforests and other things, it hasn't undergone that same type of paradigm shift. But let's go back to the Clinton administration. In the late 1990s, they published a comprehensive report which went sector by sector and identified how America needed to change its transportation, its agricultural, its industrial capacity to deal ultimately with the issue of carbon, which tends to become a surrogate in the popular mind for everything related to sustainability. In the year 2000, we have a shift again. The Bush versus Gore presidential race, the Bush administration changes its policy to what we seem to recognize today, which is the bit drill, baby drill, and essentially energy dominance. In that same time frame, where economists and geologists were predicting a diminished oil and gas recovery, a concept invented in Texas called hydraulic fracturing or fracking yields tremendous quantities of natural gas in Pennsylvania, Oklahoma, and Texas. The Obama years from 2008 to 2015 basically lifted up a concept known as greening US EPA. And in this particular pamphlet, what happened was that EPA, where I'd worked for 26 years, had decided to advocate sustainability concepts in cleaning up Superfund sites, etc. However, in terms of driving this back toward carbon, what happens is national legislation in the form of a cap and trade bill is never enacted. However, there are two representative trading regimes that still exist today on which sustainability concepts and, to the extent, managing and mitigating impacts of carbon can still be found. One is called the Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which regulates power plant emissions in the Northeast, and the other is the much more comprehensive California cap and trade system, which accounts for everything in their economy. Now, I might point out that the current political discussion aside, if you wanted to see essentially how a cap and trade system would work, California, depending on the citation, is either the fourth or fifth largest economy in the world by gross domestic product. If they can make it work in California, it could essentially work anywhere. So now we come to the current administration that has decided that it's going to implement the baby drill energy dominance on steroids, withdraw from the Paris Climate Accords, totally restructure the federal government to deal with energy dominance. These are concerning actions, and essentially the idea is for the United States to continue to build on its world dominance of energy markets and thereby extract concessions from other countries. We're seeing this go on a daily basis by virtue of the tariffs. Now, this is all pushing aside the concept of sustainability, where the larger lens of mandate versus motivate now plays into this dramatic change in events is essentially the era of government mandating action on sustainability and, in parentheses, carbon has passed for the time being. So what's going to have to happen is we're going to have to come up with motivational approaches. And the good news is that courtesy, believe it or not, of artificial intelligence, quantum computing, enhanced environmental monitoring, these things are possible. So where are we in terms of sustainability in 20 and 25? Corporate governance, even with the withdrawal of the federal government, is still part of the solution. Why is corporate governance? Because they have boards of directors, some of whom may advocate concepts and practices in terms of sustainability. Public utilities, with their tie to all sectors of state economies, is in a strong position to use data to promote sustainability through technology and management practices. This is extremely important because the public utility sector, even if it's investor-owned, is still responsible to customers in terms of basic life services, electricity, water, solid waste, and therefore there is direct and almost immediate accountability. So if we come back to what the most recent concept of sustainability is involved is the net zero all-electric economy. Is it still achievable? Yes, but we're going to have to update things, both the method and the message, the messenger and the metrics. So now we come to the core concept of this presentation, the utility of the future. It's a durable and metrically driven role model. The public utility, electric, natural gas, water, wastewater, and solid waste management, is in fact the public-private linkage and also interacts with environmental groups to engage with all stakeholders in a legally designated service area. That's a fancy way of saying the state authorizes their monopoly in a given service area. The public utility has, for a long period of time, certainly since the late 1990s, been comfortable in adapting to mandates and motivate formulas with and communication with customers on sustainability. Now, one of the more problematic problems with the public utility is that they have to include sustainability concepts into electric rates, electric natural gas rates. And people right now are experiencing very high electric rates in New Jersey, in the Northeast, and across the country for any variety of reasons. But let's go back to a concept, economic, is called an environmental externality. Starting in the late 1980s, where people were writing papers, trying to define exactly how much customers would pay for, we'll call it a green adder or a sustainability adder into their electric bills. It turned out they didn't have the data. But over the period of the past 35 to 40 years, with a lot of econometric research, people have been able to define, not absolutely precisely, but pretty carefully, what people will pay for a green factor in their electric bills and natural gas bills. This doesn't necessarily include everything that goes across the private sector. For example, in personal care products, we found that sustainable sourcing of basic inputs to the personal care products, people are willing to pay for that. One of the problem areas across all of consumer products is packaging, and both the primary and secondary and tertiary impacts that has on sustainability. So what this means is that the public and private sector have to have firm metrics, and that means the fancy econometric studies that I talked about, to justify the costs associated with sustainable technology and management practice. At the end of the day, whatever a private sector firm does or public utility does, it has to add value and be measurable at some level for the product and services they provide. So let's take a look at some successful programs that I've had an association with, and this comes under the Motivate legacy. The one that you may be most familiar with is invented by the United States Environmental Protection Agency, called Energy Star. The second one was a Department of Energy program called Climate Wise, which focused on the industrial sector. There's another rating mechanism called LEED, which applies to buildings and communities. This was developed by a non-governmental organization called the United States Green Building Council. When it comes down to natural resources, we have two successful NGOs. One is the Marine Stewardship Council, and the other is the Forest Products Stewardship Council. Let me digress a little into the Marine Stewardship Council. In this particular case, this is something that only somebody from my age would remember, is there was a popular TV series in the early or late 1960s called Flipper, and it involved a dolphin. Now, this dolphin developed a wide TV audience. Essentially, what was happening in terms of the popular consumption of tuna, the tuna and the dolphins often schooled together. And so when it became known that indiscriminate harvesting of the tuna was also entrapping tuna, or rather dolphins in the net, essentially an outcry evolved. And essentially what evolved was a dolphin-safe labeling program by StarKist and other of the major tuna harvesters. This was the start of product identification associated with natural resources. The Forest Product Stewardship Council essentially evolved to basically say that if you're going to use certain types of wood, teak or mahogany, they have to be harvested responsibly. These are long established partnerships that the private and public sector have had for decades. So let's get down to the New Jersey example. And this is a national, if not an international, role model. Public service, electric and gas, depending on the years in which you measured it, was either the second or largest investor-owned combined electric and natural gas utility in the country. Its former president, with whom I had a relationship back when I worked with state government, had a PhD in physics from Columbia and an MBA from Rutgers. He decided he was going to take public service into a sustainability business model. In so doing, he collapsed his power fleet, electric power generation fleet in the state down to a couple of natural gas plants, but largely on nuclear, and then set about in the business model of implementing an emphasis on energy efficiency, solar, and to more limited extent, wind. So now, within the public service electric and gas, it not only has a business model, but it has a director of sustainability, and then it has a manager of a program called the Utility of the Future to implement sustainability practices and technologies. Now, the utility is still under a mandate from the New Jersey Public Board of Public Utilities to implement New Jersey sustainability goals, but essentially this is more of a cooperative motivational thing rather than a mandate. However, as an investor-owned equity and debt financed utility, Wall Street carefully manages and observes if, in fact, an electric utility goes too far and it impacts rates of return. So now, if we were to try and take what we've covered to date and look at how we might implement this across the country using public service electric and gas as a role model, it becomes very complicated, largely because there are certain states, such as Texas, that have their own electric grid and will not cooperate with anyone else in terms of basically shipping electricity out or importing in needed energy supplies. When the TV ads that say Texas is a whole other country, it sort of applies to their national state of affairs. California is a good role model, but it's had problems promoting its approach both to carbon and electricity management up to other states in the Northwest. Part of this feeds into the concept of using hydropower. As we now know, hydropower is a very benevolent form of generating electricity, but it also has impact on ecological systems. And so over the past decades, there's been a certain emphasis of undamming rivers and streams to allow those ecological systems to prosper and regenerate. This is one of those issues where the mandate and the motivate collide. And sometimes they're competing and irreconcilable, at least for the moment. So with this, I will conclude my remarks for today.